Good morning, everybody. It's good to see all of you this morning. In light of the unfortunate death of yet another eight chayalim this past Shabbat, and there may have been more that I just missed since then, I just would like to dedicate, it's the least that we could do, to dedicate our learning this morning to their memory. This week's Parashat HaShavua, Parashat Vayechi, brings to a close probably the greatest saga in the entire Chumash, certainly in the entire Sefer Bereshit, and a saga within a saga. And I'm referring to the greater saga, or the macro saga, the life of Yaakov Avinu, as he passes away at the end of our parasha, and the micro story, I suppose, of Sipur Yosef, the story of Yosef and his brothers. At the end of the parasha, we find the passage regarding the death of Yaakov Avinu that I referred to just a moment ago, and because of the obscure way in which it's presented, we find a fascinating statement, a statement that I would imagine that we are all familiar with in some way or another. And that statement is, Yaakov Avinu lo met, that Yaakov Avinu did not die. And to be sure, there are those that take that statement literally, and of course, there are those, myself included, who do not take that statement and similar statements to be meant in the literal sense. This morning, we will explore the source of that particular statement in the way that is presented in the Gemara, but we will also begin with the text itself in the Chumash, and we'll see what exactly it is from a linguistic perspective, or by a word omission perspective, that leads to such a statement in the first place. So at the very end of Sefer Bereshit, in Perek Memtet, we find the following. Yaakov is about to die. He actually has said to them, Hinei anochi met. I am going to die now. Keep in mind that he does use that word. However, when it comes to his actual death, the act of his passing away, we do not find that word. Beginning with Perek Memtet, Pasuk Chavtet, Yaakov tells his sons as follows, Kivru oti al avotai, bury me together with my ancestors. Indeed, you cannot be buried, of course, unless you are going to be no longer with us. Ela ma'ara asher bisidei Ephron hachiti. In the same cave, the cave that belonged to Ephron hachiti that I purchased. And then in Pasuk Lamed, he goes on to explain a little bit further. Avi Herzog just misspoke, but that my grandfather, that grandpa Avraham, bought from Ephron hachiti for a possession. Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Lamed Aleph, why do I wish to be buried there? Because that again is where they are buried. Shama Kavru et Avraham, that's where they buried Avraham, Ve'et Sarah Ishto and his wife Sarah. Shama Kavru et Yitzchak, that's where they buried Yitzchak, Ve'et Rivka Ishto and his wife Rivka, the Shama Kavarti et Leah, and that's where I buried Leah. By the way, I was caught off guard this past Thursday when I delivered a shiur in the yeshiva where I teach, Yeshivat Migdal HaTorah, a boys' American Gap Year program in Modi'in, and one of my students caught me off guard. When he came to the words, Shama Kavru et Yitzchak ve'et Rivka ishto, open parentheses, he didn't ask this question about Leah, but it applies to her too. He asked it about Rivka. He asked me straight out, he said, where do we find elsewhere in the Chumash that Rivka actually died? And it caught me off guard. He asked me, do we indeed find that? And I said, without thinking for a moment, I said, of course we do. So I looked back to Parashat Vayishlach, which could be the only place where her death is actually mentioned, and indeed it's not there. And as I was searching and beginning to wonder if I still have all of my faculties, as I sometimes do, as I would imagine we all do, I began to remember some sort of discussion about this. So I double-checked with another faculty member, and sure enough, and some of you may be aware of this, Rivka's death is never mentioned anywhere. The only recording we have of it is here when Yaakov informs his children that Ma'arat HaMachpelah is where Rivka my mother was buried. And the same thing is true with Shama Kavarti et Leah. That's where I buried my wife, the mother of half of you children, in Marat Machpelah, where I buried Leah. Her death also was not mentioned earlier. In fact, I believe it's only 4 women whose passing is mentioned in the Chumash itself directly. And they are Sarah, Devorah, who was Rivka's meineket, her nursemaid, as it were, for lack of a better word, at least on my part. And then we find later on the other 2 are escaping the offhand, and I sincerely apologize for that. But there are 2 others that are mentioned. In any event, Pasuk Lamed Bet, Miknei Hasadeh v'hama'ara asher bo, the field, the cave that is in it that I bought from Bnei Chet. And then at the very end of Pasuk Lamed Gimel, or this piece, Yaakov finishes to speak to his children. Vayesof raglav el hamita. He gathered his legs to his bed. Vayigva, obviously that's a metaphor, and so is the following. Vayigva vayeasef el amav. Now vayigva can mean, it also has different interpretations, but it can mean that he, in today's parlance, there are those who do not, who prefer not to use this term regarding somebody's passing. He expired, or his soul expired. And I know that there are those that are opposed to it from a politically correct perspective, because we talk about a parking permit or a parking meter expiring, and we shouldn't refer to people in the same breath, in the same vein, excuse me. Okay, but be that as it may, that's what Vayigva seems to mean. Vayeasef el amav, and he was gathered to his people. And again, it's obviously a metaphor for Yaakov dying. But it does not say straight out anywhere in the Chumash the word Vayamot or anything else with that shoresh regarding what took place, that Yaakov himself actually died. We do find that by Abraham, and we do find that by Yitzchak. It is this omission that leaves room for the statement that Yaakov Avinu lo met. Further on, excuse me, in the next parak, or immediately following this, in the aftermath, we find Vayachantu harofiim et Yisrael, that Yaakov Avinu was embalmed. You can't embalm somebody, you cannot mummify somebody if they're not dead. And furthermore, at the very end of this passage, we find Vayis'u oto vanav artsa Canaan, that Yaakov's children carried him to Canaan, Vayikbiru oto, and they buried him. And again, you're not going to bury somebody if they're still alive. In other words, it's very obvious from the text, and it's also very obvious by the way of all human flesh, of all flesh, that every single person that lives dies. The one exception may be Eliyahu Hanavi, based on the obscure way in which it is described that he ascended to Shamayim. But beyond that, every single person that has ever lived has apparently died. If that's the case, it's clear that, and especially given all of the other activities or actions that take place surrounding the death of Yaakov, that he indeed died, despite the fact that the word Vayamot is not mentioned. Okay, Rashi, picking up on this, quotes the Gemara that we will see soon, and Rashi says, Umita lo ne'emravo. The verb death, the noun of death, is not used by him. Va'amru rabotenu zichronam livracha, and the Chachamim therefore said, Yaakov Avinu lo met. Yaakov did not die. Okay, the question is what is meant by that. We have no way of knowing if Rashi, at least I don't think we do, if Rashi took the statement to be meant literally, because Rashi doesn't say. He's simply quoting the statement in the Gemara. He also says, Rabotenu, Zichronam Livracha. In fact, he's referring to one individual of two that got together for lunch one day, as we will see. Or maybe it was dinner. Let's take a look at the Ramban. Ramban explains what he believes it means. No surprises here if we're familiar with Ramban's general gisha or approach. And Ramban, after quoting Rashi, says, Uledat Rabotenu, according to this view in the Gemara of Yaakov Avinu lo met, Harei Yaakov hiskir mita ba'atzmo. Before he passed away, Yaakov himself mentioned that he was going to die. And Avi Herzog, quoted this earlier, and that is, before he passed away, he said to his children, Hine anochi mate, I am going to die, v'haya Elokim imachem, and God should be with you. Godspeed. Okay, so how can we reconcile the two? If Yaakov says, I'm going to die, we know that he died. How can one of the Chachamim of Chazal, of the time period of the Gemara, come along and then make a seemingly wild and off-the-mark statement that he didn't die? So trying to rationalize this or to understand this, what Ramban states is, Ulai lo yadahu b'nafsho. The very fact that Yaakov said, I'm going to die, isn't proof that he did die. Maybe he didn't know that he wasn't going to die a death the way of all human beings. Maybe he just assumed he was going to die because that's what people do when they leave this world, but he was not aware of the fact that God had a secret that he was going to depart from this world in a different way. Oh, Ramban says, perhaps lo ratza latet kavod bishmo, he himself knew on some level that he wasn't going to die in the sense that we all understand it, but he didn't want to gloat, he didn't want to give more kavod to himself than to anybody else, and therefore he kept the secret to himself. But Ramban himself writes as follows. V'inyan ha-midrash hazeh, what this midrash really means, in other words, what this member of Chazal, we will soon see that this is Rabbi Yitzchak, felt is, ki nafshot hatzadikim sururot bitzror hachayim. We're all familiar with the phrase that we often say of a person after they pass away, Tehei nishmato or nishmata surura bitzror hachayim, may their nefesh, may their soul be bound up in the bound of life. So we're referring, according to Ramban, to Yaakov's nefesh living on, to him living on in a spiritual sense, but of course, not living on in a literal sense, because people just don't do that after they pass away. That's the view of Ramban. Let's go back to the original source. The source is as follows. Tomorrow, by the way, I am presenting a longer version of this shiur representing the OU in Modi'in, in a program there that is referred to, or that is called, Kolel Boker, and I will be the speaker representing the OU, God willing, tomorrow in the 11:45 time slot. Why am I mentioning this? Number one, why not? But number two, directly related to this, afterwards I plan to get together with a friend for lunch. That's exactly what seems to have transpired here. Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yitzchak, the two of them, hayavu yatvei bisu'udata. In Hebrew, hayoshvim li su'uda. They were sitting down together for a meal. They went out to Bagel Cafe. Amar le Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yitzchak. Rav Nachman said to Rabbi Yitzchak, Lema mar milta. Literally that means, if you, sir, would please say something, say a milah. The word davar in Hebrew also means a milah. And he basically means, in today's parlance, if you could please share a dvar Torah with me. We're sitting together anyway, and we may as well learn some Torah. So I'd like to hear some words of Torah from you. Please share a dvar Torah. Amar le, Rabbi Yitzchak answered to him, I will after we're done eating. What he actually said was, Hachi amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan has said as follows, Ein mesichin b'seuda. One should not engage in conversation when they're eating. Now, by the way, keep in mind that Rabbi Yitzchak is actually stating this while he's eating, but nevertheless, one should not engage, of course, in a lengthier conversation when they're eating, or not speak if they do not have to. Why? Because it could be dangerous. In other words, don't talk with food in your mouth, because of the fact that, for several reasons, he doesn't mention because it's rude or it's not acceptable. Maybe in those days and in that locale, I don't know, maybe it wasn't considered to be rude, but in any event, Shema yakdim kaneh laveshet. That maybe the windpipe, maybe the trachea, literally yakdim will come kodem, will come before or will open up while you're eating instead of the veshet, instead of the esophagus, instead of the food pipe. By the way, if you're like me and you confuse the two terms, trachea, esophagus, which is the windpipe, which is the food pipe, I remember it from the sound in the middle of the word esophagus. And even though it's spelled with a PH, that reminds me of the F sound in the word food. And that's how I correlate esophagus with the food pipe. But in any event, one could indeed put their lives in danger because the food may go down the wrong pipe. And therefore, one cannot really engage in conversation unless they need to Like for me to remind you, Rav Nachman, that I cannot share Dvar Torah with you now while they're eating. Okay. Batar de Sa'ud, after they completed their meal, Amarle, then Rabbi Yitzchak decided, okay, now I can share Dvar Torah with you. And this is what he said. Hachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. And he's quoting Rabbi Yochanan. Now, what's interesting is he's quoting the very same Rabbi Yochanan, I believe, that he quoted before. And so I'm assuming that the reason he's continuing with Rabbi Yochanan is because he already quoted Rabbi Yochanan as saying, I cannot share Dvar Torah with you while I'm eating. So the very least I could do now when I am sharing Dvar Torah with you, now that we've completed our feast, now that we've completed our meal, is to quote Rabbi Yochanan. So he does. Hachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan, this is what Rabbi Yochanan said, Yaakov Avinu lo met. And therein is the source. Yaakov Avinu did not die. Apparently, Rav Nachman, his buddy, his lunchmate, was taken completely by surprise. So Amarle, he said to him, hey, come on. I mean, you're a member of Chazal. You can do better than that. You know that can't possibly be true. V'chi bichdi sefadu. You mean to tell me that while they indeed eulogized him, v'chanatu chanataya, and they embalmed him, ukivaru kivaraya, and they buried him. So come on, you're actually telling me, you Rabbi Yitzchak, who should know better, that he didn't die? How is that possible? Amar Le, he said to him, Rabbi Yitzchak answered him, yeah, I know the Chumash, come on. I know the Torah by heart just like you do. After all, I'm one of Chazal, so of course I know the Chumash. But, Mikra ani doresh. I am deducing this from another verse, not from the omission that Avi Herzog mentioned, but from an actual asmachta, or a proof text. Not a proof, just a proof text of sorts. Shene Emar, there is a pasuk in Sefer, I believe it's in Sefer Tehillim, that states as follows. Ve'ata, obviously it is a different context there, or a different, an entirely different topic. Ve'ata, and you, al tira avdi Yaakov. Do not fear my servant Yaakov, Nu'um Hashem, said God. Fa'al techat Yisrael, that's simply a repetition. Do not fear Yisrael, for ki hineni moshi acha, for I will save you, meirachok, from a distance. Again, the context there is not for us this morning. Ve'et zaracha me'eretz shivam, and your future generations and your offspring and your descendants from the land of their captivity. Okay, how does that serve as a proof text for the idea, for the concept of Yaakov Avinu not dying? Mekish hu lizaro. Rabbi Yitzchak explained in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the pasuk is equating Yaakov to his descendants. In other words, I will save you, says God, ve'et zaracha, and your zera, and your seed, and your future generations from the land of their shevi, from the land of their captivity. Mazar o b'chayim, just as Yaakov's descendants, meaning today's generation, when we are sitting today having our coffee and are alive, afu b'chayim. Since it mentions Yaakov's descendants and Yaakov in the same breath, and now God, I'm going to save you, and I'm going to save your descendants, afu b'chayim. Just like his descendants are alive, just like you, my dear friend Rav Nachman, and I are able to share words of Torah now after having our meal, afu b'chayim, Yaakov himself is also still alive. It sounds wild, and obviously, Rabbi Yitzchak, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, does not mean to imply, as I said, that this pasuk proves at all, by any stretch of the imagination, that Yaakov Avinu did not die. It's simply another way of viewing things. And that's all he could possibly mean. And that's the end of that particular piece of Gemara. However, there is another Gemara which tells us as follows. Darash Rabbi Pinchas ben Chama. And this excerpt may shed light on the intention of Rabbi Yitzchak in this statement. Rabbi Pinchas ben Chama said as follows. We find another pasuk regarding David HaMelech that Hadad Shama b'Mitzrayim. Hadad, we're not going to get into now who Hadad was. We don't have the time frame, unfortunately, this morning for biographies and the like, but it doesn't really matter. He heard in Mitzrayim, Kishachav David im Avotav. Now again, he didn't hear ki mate David, that David died. He heard ki shachav David im avotav, that David lied down with his ancestors, with his fathers. It doesn't use the word death. V'chi mate, the pasuk continues, v'chi mate Yoav sar hatzava, and that Yoav, the army general, died. So the word mate, the word died, is used by Yoav, but it's not used by David. And so the Gemara asks the question, according to Rabbi Pinchas, Mipnei ma b'David ne'emra bo shechiva u'v'Yoav ne'emra bo mita. Why by David does it say that he simply lied down and couches the idea of his death? But u'v'Yoav ne'emra bo mita. But by Yoav, it actually uses the word death. The Gemara answers, David, by David, sheiniach ben, that he left behind a son. In other words, he had children. Ne'emra bo shechiva. It uses the word shechiva, of lying down, instead of he died, which is another way of saying, of course, we understand that he lived on through his children, and not in the literal sense that he died. Yoav, shelo hiniach ben, Yoav, who did not have a son or a daughter, ne'emra bo mita. It uses the word death, because once he passed on, that was the end of his family. So his family was no longer alive either. And then the Gemara goes on to ask as follows. The only problem with that statement is it's a very nice idea, but it's just not true. The Yoav lo hiniach ben, and Yoav didn't have any children. We do have another pasuk that actually names Yoav's children. So of course he had children. So what do you mean the term that mate is used by Yoav because he didn't have any children? So the Gemara simply restates this or reformulates this as David shehiniach ben kimoto. What I meant is David, who left behind a son like him, who carried on David's teachings and way of life. Ne'emra bo shechiva. Yoav, shelo hiniach ben kimoto. Yoav, who did not leave behind a son like him. Ne'emra bo mita. Yoav had children who led a different lifestyle. And because of that, in that sense, he didn't have children, meaning they did not carry on his particular lifestyle and what he brought to this world. And therefore, the word mita applies to him. Okay. Just to bring home what we stated before in the name of Ramban, the Torah Temimah makes this a little bit more personal and a little bit more clear. He actually speaks in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak in the Gemara, as I tried to do before, but Torah Temimah puts it much more succinctly and better than Avi Herzog did. And he explains as follows, the Torah Temimah. Tishuvat Rabbi Yitzchak, Mikra ani doresh, the answer of Rabbi Yitzchak to his lunchmate, Rav Nachman, that I am deducing this from another obscure verse, Perushakach. What Rabbi Yitzchak meant was as follows. What he meant was, I of course know that Yaakov died. I'm not stupid. Omnam, it is true, ani modeh, I admit, says the Torah Temimah as the mouthpiece for Rabbi Yitzchak, I admit Yaakov made the muvan hapashut, that Yaakov did die in the simple sense of the term. Of course he physically died. Afkevan shezar o b'chayim, but since his future generations, his seed is alive, not just that they are living, dahainu, but rather that means Yaakov hiniach banim kishirim b'tzadikim kemoto, that Yaakov left in his place, left to succeed him, banim that were kishirim, that were fit v'tzadikim and were righteous just like him. Nechshav hadavar ki'ilu hu atzmo chai. It's considered as if he is still alive. The very same message that is imparted to us in that second excerpt that I just read to you from the Gemara Masechet Bava Batra, regarding David contrasted with Yoav ben Suriyah. L'chachi kabati, that is what I, Rabbi Yitzchak, meant, continues Torah Temima, Kishe amarti sheYaakov lo met. When I said Yaakov Avinu did not die. V'lachen ein makom lishe'elatcha, and therefore your questions, they fall by the wayside. Your questions of how could they have eulogized him and how could they have embalmed him and buried him, etc. Because of course they did. I know that they did. Ki lo hitkavanti lomar, I didn't, heaven forbid, mean to imply shalom meit b'muvan hapashut, that he didn't actually die. Okay. It is with this in mind, with this background, that I would like to come to another obscure pasuk. And even though the term Vayamot, he died, is used referring to this individual, and the individual in question is Moshe Rabbeinu at the very end of the Chumash, at the same time, there is some obscurity here, which leads to yet another obscure statement by Chazal. The Torah tells us as follows at the very end of the Chumash. Vayamot sham Moshe Eved Hashem be'eretz Moav. Moshe died, Moshe the servant of God died in the land of Moav, al pi Hashem, by the word of God. The next pasuk tells us as follows. Vayikbor oto, he buried him, Bagai, in the valley, be'eretz Moav, in the land of Moav. It happens to be located, if you're looking for a landmark, opposite Beit Peor, which means nothing to you and me today, but it did in those days. V'lo yada ish et kivurato ad hayom hazeh. And no one knew of his burial place, of his kivurah, ad hayom hazeh, until this day. Meaning at least until the time that the Chumash was written, but perhaps even later than that. There is an opinion that whenever the Torah uses the term ad hayom hazeh, literally meaning until this day, it's not only until the day that the words are recorded, but it's actually until this very day that you are reading these words. That means right now, in the year, even to this day, in the year Tafshin Pei Gimel, if I did that right, Tafshin Pei Dalet, excuse me, or 2023, Ad Hayom Hazeh, it is still true that no man knows of Moshe Rabbeinu's burial place. And that is indeed the case. Based on these two phrases, or these two clauses in that pasuk, we're going to come to something fascinating. The opening of that pasuk, if you remember, I read to you was Vayikbar Oto, he buried him. What's obviously omitted here is who buried him. That's further, that's number one. Number two, there's something a little bit off the mark here regarding the words V'lo yada ish et kivurato, and I'll explain what I mean in a moment. But regarding Vayikbor Oto, he buried him, without the Chumash telling us, even indirectly, who the he is that buried him. Therefore, Rashi, quoting the Midrash, tells us as follows: Hakadosh Baruch Hu Bichvodo. Hakadosh Baruch Hu, God Himself, buried Moshe Rabbeinu. How? What does that possibly mean? The simple answer, and I think the only answer, is we don't know, we weren't there. Okay. Not only that, if indeed it is true that nobody knows where he's buried, who else could have buried him? If a person buried him, then that person would have known where he was buried, and maybe he would have told somebody else. So the only way for this to have been kept an absolute secret without leaking the news of his kivurah would be if the Vayikbor Oto, the he buried him, is a reference to God Himself as the one that buried Moshe Rabbeinu. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Rabbi Yishmael actually has another take on it, is that Vayikbor, he buried him, the he is Moshe Rabbeinu, that he buried himself. As difficult as that may be for any of us to conceive of a person burying themselves, nevertheless, that is the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, because these would be the only two options if indeed no one knew of his burial. Okay. The other issue, though, is that while it is true that to this day, Moshe Rabbeinu's burial plot, his place of burial, has not been discovered, and I imagine it never will be. And by the way, a very fascinating piece of information in case we're not aware. Very often, burial places where we do know where a person is buried are indeed not where they're buried at all. I think I mentioned this before in one of these shiurim, this series of CHIZUK shiurim, and that is that Kever Rachel is most probably not where Rachel is buried, but it doesn't really matter, because as long as we have a place where we can memorialize her, even if we are off the mark, at the end of the day, so what? At the end of the day, why is that really important? But it most probably is true that Kever Rachel is not actually Kever Rachel, is not actually where she is buried. Furthermore, it is now known with 100% certitude that some of the kivarim that people go to visit, the grave sites that people go to visit in Tzfat, for example, of some of the great Kabbalists that have passed away. Well, of course they passed away because it was hundreds of years ago, where they are buried, are not their actual burial sites. They're somewhere in that general area, and one day it was decided by an individual, a group of individuals, let us associate this particular place and let's mark it with a marker, with either a matzeva or just a marker, whatever it may be, for this particular one of the greats from the Kabbalist time period that passed away. But some of them really indeed are off the mark. We do not know when Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, where Moshe Rabbeinu is buried. That is true. But if one pays close attention to the wording, that is actually not what the pasuk says. You see, there's a difference in Hebrew between a kever, which is a grave, and a kivurah, which is the act of burial. Kivurah does not mean his burial place. Technically, kivurah means the act of his burial. Now, I, Avi Herzog, am not saying that the Chumash is not implying that we do not know where he is buried. I believe the Chumash is implying that. But I also believe that the Chumash, given the wording, that the Torah states, "V'lo yadai ish et kivurato," that no man knows, no human being knows or ever will know of his burial place, of his kivurah, but using the word kivurah instead of kever, instead of kivro, his kever, his burial place, is also alluding to something else. And that is that nobody knew of the act of Moshe Rabbeinu's burial. Not only did they not know his birthplace, but they weren't even aware of his burial itself. So come on, you'll ask me, how could that be? So I personally would like to suggest that what the Chumash is telling us here is just like Yaakov Avinu did not die in the literal sense. Yaakov Avinu lo met. And just like by David HaMelech, the word shechiva is used rather than the word mitah, as is used in the same, in the same context in the Chumash regarding Yoav, in the same pasuk even, regarding Yoav ben Tzruya, the army general. For David HaMelech lives on too, for he left behind banim kesherim, in the words of the Gemara. Similarly, Moshe Rabbeinu did not die either. Of course Yaakov died. Of course David died. And of course Moshe Rabbeinu died. The Torah even says, as I mentioned before, Vayamot Moshe Eved Hashem, that Moshe, the servant of God, died. But nobody knew of his burial. How so? Because he was able to impart to Bnei Israel the way of life that he wished for them to live upon their entry into Eretz Israel, which he was not privileged to enter himself. And even though Bnei Israel will in very short order rebel, and they will continue to rebel just like they did, and just like we still do today, but just like they did in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu while he was alive, at the same time, at least for a short term, they had committed themselves to living the lifestyle that Moshe would have liked for them to live as the Am HaNivchar, as Am Yisrael. And in that sense, I believe the Torah is telling us that not only V'lo yada ish et kivro, which it does not say in the text, that no man knew of his burial place, of his actual grave, but lo yada ish et kavurato, that nobody knew, meaning that people did not even sense his burial, in the sense that Moshe Rabbeinu lived on through their actions, through their deeds. Yaakov Avinu lo met. He brought to this world so much, and what he brought to this world lived on through his children and future generations. And he, Yaakov Avinu, has to continue living on through us, just as Moshe Rabbeinu does, ad hayom hazeh, as the pasuk states. And there's a direct connection to our time too. In addition to our doing everything we can, in whatever way we can, to see to it that all of those that have passed away so far in this war, to see to it that they live on. In addition to that, this past Friday, Asara B'Tevet, as we know, has been deemed by the Rabbanut as Yom HaKadish HaKlali, a day in which Kaddish is recited for those that passed away in the Shoah, whose yahrzeit we unfortunately do not know. And so if we do not know their yahrzeit, then at least we can act as if the 10th of Tevet is the day of their yahrzeit, to help bring some closure to them, to their families, and to all of us who are alive today, who continue to live a life that would make them proud, and in this way to be sure that their memories not only live on, but in that sense, Yaakov Avinu lo met, that they too, indeed, continue to live on. Unfortunately, now we have to add to that list many whose bodies have been discovered, chayalim, shivuyim, captives, and therefore we do not know their exact date of death either. And again, the greatest way that we can pay tribute to them, in addition to our sharing words of Torah today in their memory, is for us to live a life in a way that we know would make them proud. Yehi zichram baruch, may their memory be for a blessing. This concludes today's shiur. I wish all of us a good week. I wish all of us a week in which we contribute to see to it that Yaakov Avinu and that all of those whom we are thinking of together with Yaakov Avinu indeed lo met. Be well.